It's week 3 of the PhD, keeping the regular video log. I've got the commencement presentation coming up this week, and well, not, it turns out not the commencement presentation. It's a bit further down the line. It's the kickoff presentation. So, meeting with the board of supervisors for the first time. So, put everything out there. Now, I do have a presentation there, and I do intend, and it's ready to go. And I intend to put that up on the next week because I can't really do that before they've seen it, and I want to get their input in any case. So for week 3, beyond the usual, please, critical feedback is very welcome, by the way. Just put that out there early. Reading continues. Not a lot to add to that. I've got some very good advice from old friends of mine who have done PhDs before, and I've started coding everything into NVivo for qualitative research purposes and also EndNote early on. I've had a historical aversion to EndNote. I just used Excel. It was a mistake. So I'm learning from my errors this time around, and instead of having to wade through a spreadsheet of ambiguous links and pieces of data at a later stage at the very end of the book, as it was last time, I've published a book, by the way, by the by. So that'll set me a good standard for this time, but either way. So I'm using EndNote this time. So automate that process. For those who aren't familiar, EndNote is a referencing software because you've got to reference everything in academia, which stands in very entertaining contrast to private industry or even government. So anyway, by the by. So for week 3, considering that the presentation is going to have to hold off, and that's pretty much the entirety of my focus this week, there's an element within the presentation that I think we need to unpack, though. Pretty essential point. As you know, the PhD focuses around hate speech, and in particular, I'm looking at focusing in on groups that, at least to start with, focusing in on groups that are, you're not going to get a lot of debate that they're unethical, right? So Nazis, neo-Nazis, NSN, whatever you want to call them, Islamic extremists slash ISIL slash ISIS style terrorism, and third, sovereign citizens. All three groups are responsible for recent attacks and violence inside the country, here and abroad for that matter. And you're not really going to struggle to justify limiting those ideas. It's Yes, it raises questions of slippery slope and overregulation and giving a basis upon which to regulate other ideas. But those ideas, in and of themselves, you're not going to get a lot of defenders of Nazis or Islamic terrorists or some sub-citizens, but really that's a very insular group, right? So there's an important point, however, because most of the time when we talk about this, and when I have talked to people about this, the feedback I get is, well, but that's already covered, right? If someone comes out and commits an act of violence or encourages a specific act of violence, well, it's already regulated. So what's the difference here? To that end, I would like to introduce you to the concept, the principle of the polite Nazi. Often, when we talk about hateful conduct, hate speech, and things along these lines, we're talking about rudeness or conduct that one will consider rude, something that is specifically harmful in and of the moment. Using a racial slur is an obvious one. Directly calling for an act of violence is another one, right? Recruiting for specifically for terrorist acts or any sort of hateful action is also another one. Pretty obvious stuff, right? And again, this is largely, well, if not regulated, then the legal framework exists and it's something that's sort of bubbling along. We all remember when there were the terror attacks against the mosques over in New Zealand by an Australian government, um, operating under a vague alt-right frame. Facebook got deeply criticized, incidentally, another study I've read this week, for not taking that footage down everywhere. It got forced to be taken off, if memory serves, inside Australia and New Zealand, but it didn't get taken down everywhere. And under vague freedom of speech provisions, not to mention, general resistance to responsibility. But either way, that's another topic. What we're talking about here, however, is a polite Nazi. Now, the principle here is pretty straightforward. I put it to you that a polite Nazi is not better than a rude Nazi. A polite Nazi, someone who is willing to engage in calm and reasonable dialogue, to work within all legal frameworks, to conduct themselves in excellent conduct in how they go about advancing their cause. There's a tendency for us to think of that person as engaging in legitimate political speech because it wears the trappings of legitimate political speech. They're not attacking you. They're not violent. They're not doing anything illegal. They're conducting themselves very, very well. In fact, they're quite polite. They're quite charming, perhaps even. Yeah. And therefore, I don't fall under our usual definition of hate speech, which is immediate. And, well, offensive is a bad word for this. Another important distinction, by the way, from an ethical perspective, offense is not very persuasive. It's very subjective, as in the only thing you need to be offended is that you are offended. You don't actually have to have a good reason or justification. You just need to feel offense and you're offended. So it's not a very persuasive case. Unethical, on the other hand, requires evidence, shall we say. So we have a problem because I put it to you thus. The polite Nazi is worse than the violent Nazi. Not because of how they're conducting themselves in the moment, but because of what they're seeking to achieve and the probability of success. The reason I oppose Nazis, actually, most of the time, has nothing to do with the way they're conducting themselves in the moment. There's plenty of people that conduct themselves like that for a variety of causes on both sides of the aisle and in every walk of life. So why Nazis specifically? It's because what they're trying to achieve. Their objectives are very clear. Now, this can get a bit more ambiguous for other groups like white nationalists or just anti-immigration people or a wide variety of other causes I disagree with. But if you call yourself a Nazi in 2026, you are aligning yourself with one very specific historical movement. There is no second go at Nazism. We have no positive examples. We have exactly one that resulted in the intentional genocide of a vast volume of people. So if in 2026 you're aligning yourself to that brand or one of its subsidiaries, then that is your objective. Now, I'm sure there's room for debate in there. I'm not interested in it, frankly, because if you were interested in a debate or nuance or subtlety, then you wouldn't have called yourself a Nazi or a National Socialist, or again, one of the variations thereof, adopted their iconography, adopted their rhetoric, blah, 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 blah. Right? So, why do I oppose Nazis? Because they want to kill about a third of the entire country for being inferior. Again, we have one historical precedent for this. It's very clear cut. I have absolutely no reason to think that there would be any variation this time around, and especially considering they're using the exact same word for that action. We're talking Jewish people, obviously. We're talking disabled people, which is an enormous category, incidentally, when you consider what Nazis meant by that. We're talking basically foreigners. We're talking people from genetic backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds or nations that they consider to be inferior, which once again, they're Nazis means everyone that isn't them. And as we know and has been discussed in many cases, fascism is an ever shrinking in group, right? It has to have an opposition. So realistically, it's probably a lot more than a third of the country. That is why Nazis are a problem. That, not because they're rude, not because they are violent, not because they're doing illegal things. So here's the problem. When a Nazi is smart enough, and it's pretty low bar, but when they're smart enough to do things clever, to do things legally, to be polite, to engage in rational conversation, and not to push any of those tactical short-term problem buttons, that's worse because it increases their chances of success. It gives them the guise of political legitimacy. It makes it easier for them to move in civilized society, and it makes them easier to recruit. Oh, it makes it easier for them to recruit. Yeah. So the implications of this for my research are significant because this is exactly why we're going at this from the dissemination of an idea as opposed to conduct. There's already plenty in the place for social media when it comes to individual conduct. It's automated to a large degree. You say the wrong word on social media and you get a temporary ban. Do it enough times and you get a permanent ban. These hateful groups are very good at navigating around that for the obvious, simple reasons of survival, right? They want their online presences. It's how they recruit. It's how they disseminate their ideas. So Important point. Why are we focusing on the dissemination of ideas or the limitation of an idea as opposed to the conduct of people that are within a movement? Because the idea is the problem. For those three groups, it's not their conduct, or at least not just their conduct, it's what they're trying to achieve. That is the problem. Their objectives are fundamentally unethical to the point of being as close to evil as I'm willing to use that word. I don't like that word. I'm an ethicist, but you get the idea. Simplistic, encourages simplistic thinking. But with those groups, fine. Let's just go with that. Evil ideas. Yeah. So where it will obviously get a lot more complex is when we scale up to more comprehensive or complex or compounded ideologies like white supremacy and anti-immigration, which combine legitimate and illegitimate ideas. Yes, I know how that sounds. Bear with me on it. I'll unpack it at a later stage. Everything's nuanced compared to Nazism, though. So, you're taking my point, right? So, the polite Nazi principle is that it is the objective of the ideology that is the problem, and therefore them being of good conduct and good standing and looking and being nice and being legal and all that sort of thing is actually worse. And it is currently a great big honking hole in our ethical frameworks when it comes to freedom of speech. Again, more reading this week, I should say, has included a review of the legal frameworks in Europe, the US, and Australia and New Zealand when it comes to freedom of speech and the foundations and limitations. And yes, you will be no doubt very shocked to hear that everywhere that has freedom of speech also has very clear limitations, either formally, informally, as part of precedent or case law, or just formally written into the Constitution. The US is no exception to this. Again, if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, of course it is. They've got classified documentation, don't they? And copyright and all that sort of thing. All limitations on speech. So this is currently a problem because nearly all of those definitions of hate speech focus on imminent harm. Well, what about the strategic harm? As in, if you say something in an environment or online or not interpersonally, incidentally, that's always an exception, which is interesting and probably a practical consideration. But either way, we don't generally want to regulate speech between two people. What we're talking about is that if you post hate speech online abusing a group racially or based on some other form of idiotic bigotry, that's another topic for another day. By the way, the ethics of bigotry and why it's unethical as opposed to just rude. There's a lot. I'll go on at length about that. But that falls under hate speech. You know, it doesn't fall under hate speech. Running a political party that is based on racism. Because it's not a call for immediate harm. It's not an immediate insult. It's strategic. And per the polite Nazi problem, actually poses a much larger threat. Because what is strategic racism or hate speech or the enablement thereof, other than a lot of instances of tactical or short-term or immediate hate speech? That's the whole point, isn't it? It's to stop making it illegal. It's to normalize things according to the ideology of the group. So that is a pretty fundamental point, and that's going to feature quite a lot in the presentation. It's something I'm going to have to continue to unpack because that is something we're going to have to codify at some point, and that is tricky. Something that everyone who knows me will have heard me say many, many, many a time to the point of ad nauseum, but it is my general observation that if you want to get down to the fundamentals of human nature and the source of the human condition, one of the major problems, humans don't think strategically. Or at least it's really, really, really hard for us, and we really, really, really suck at it. But we're amazing in the short term. We're incredible tactically. Yeah. Individually, as a community, my example here is bushfires versus climate change, right? Bushfires in Australia are just a yearly occurrence. They're so common. It's just the way things go. And every part of the Australian community knows exactly what to do. We don't need to be told. We appreciate it. It's helpful to get direction, and we don't object to getting direction from the government about these things. We've got multiple systems in place that respond to the bushfire. Everyone knows their role. You evacuate, you prepare, you join the CFA, you contribute, and even if you're completely uninvolved in the fires, you don't object to government resources being spent on the fires because obviously, like what else is the government for, right? But two, you will often contribute voluntarily, right? Like as in give donations, volunteer your time, etc., and etc. The worse the fires are, the more that happens. And that's brilliant. That is a fantastic practical response to a practical problem. Fire exists, fix fire, support fix of fire, support recovery. Every step of that is fantastic. It's down to a science here in Victoria. Yes, we have our failures, but we learn, and even that, when we screw up, we learn from it and things go into place to prevent it from happening again in the future. Climate change, on the other hand, I probably don't need to explain why we've failed at that one. And I would suggest that a large part of that is that it's too abstract. It's too big. It's not a thing that is happening right now in front of us. That you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't blow water all over it and put it out. It's a complex series of problems all woven into a single title. Doesn't mean it can't be solved. In fact, that's kind of the problem. That's part of the observation. It's really not that hard to solve if you had total control over the world's economies, but obviously the variety of interests involved from it being such a massive thing. The balance between opportunity for profit by not helping, always a killer for humans. If there's a profit incentive in not contributing to the solution, then you've got a rent seeker problem. People will just, some asshole is always, yeah, well, some asshole is always going to take advantage of the situation, aren't they? Because they can. If there's a profit for it, why wouldn't they? And now we have a problem that you're disincentivized. You're putting yourself as at a competitive disadvantage by actively contributing to the solution. Yeah? So anyway, we're getting into depth here, but the point stands is that strategic, it's hard. In fact, we start to get to the point where people start to go into denial that the problem even exists, at least in my estimation, largely because that's just easier than accepting that it's a problem, which it is, unfortunately, and you can get away with it, at least for a while. Compare that to a bushfire. Anyone who goes into denial about the existence of a bushfire is going to get disabused of that in short order. So, all of this is going to have to get factored in there somehow. As you can probably tell, I'm in a little bit of a weird space when it comes to trying to figure out how all this fits together. There's a lot. This is huge. This is a massive potential topic, and scope control, as is noted in this presentation, is going to be pretty critical. So hopefully these videos will help with that as well. We've watched back a couple of them already. It's gonna get interesting. Anyway, that's week 3. Week 4, I'll come back with that presentation.